Hello, everyone. I think we're going to get started. We want to thank you for joining us today on our webinar, Why Agile is Much More Than Scrum. Hopefully, everyone can see the slides. If you can't, you'll be able to ask a question, raise a chat, raise your hand. Please let us know if you're having any technical difficulties. But we just want to say thank you for joining us this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are. Your hosts today are going to be myself. My name is Alex Adamopoulos. I'm the CEO of Emergent Limited. Also joining me is Philip Black. Philip is our COO. And together we are looking to build on a narrative today and construct a story on the topic. The purpose is to give you some authentic feedback on what we're seeing in the marketplace, what many in our community share with us on a daily or weekly basis, and hopefully you'll find the information both useful and helpful for your own organizations. We do welcome feedback at the end of the session. If you have any suggestions for how we could have improved this, or if you have any interest in other topics that might be related you'd like to have us address, please do send through a note and we'll do our best to do that. Just some housekeeping tips for today's webinar. The goal is to do this in 45 minutes. That includes Q&A at the end. There's a couple different ways you can ask questions. One is you can wait till the end. We're looking to leave about 10 minutes for that. Or you're welcome to type in a question and we'll make every attempt to answer it either on today's call or offline. If you have any additional questions, we'll give you our email addresses at the end, but they're very simple. It's alex@emergent.com or phil@emergent.com. And participants will be getting an email after the webinar with a link to the recording in case you want to share it with any colleagues inside your organization. So let's dive in. Just wanted to share with you some of the context for why we chose this title for today's webinar. There are 3 points that are important to point out here. One is that traditional Agile methods and Agile training has proven not to be capable of delivering the change that organizations are looking for beyond a software project. These are challenges we continue to see, and some of the people in our community, maybe even some of you have shared that with us or share that sentiment. We also want to demonstrate how a work-based learning approach coupled with the right amount of expertise is transforming program and project delivery, and how it's also building internal capability. So you can see from this slide, there's some information we're going to share with you today on a real customer journey for Maersk Line that we'll be talking about in the next few minutes. The other point is that people in enterprises who have been the most successful in becoming agile, if that's the right term, or introducing this thinking in their organization, are those that have gone beyond traditional frameworks like Scrum. And so one of the purposes of our presentation today is to show you how there's much more to the whole idea of introducing agile thinking into your company. The last thing I'd say here is the comments we're making today, the statements we're making today, they're all based out of personal experiences we've had as an organization, as well as insights shared by people in our community. And so when we use the word community, we're talking about our own people, we're talking about customers, we're talking about colleagues, and we're even talking about competitors, people we work and collaborate with in the market on a regular basis. So the idea was to bring a very holistic view to the message and try to give you as much insight on the topic as we could. So here we wanted to present a couple key things that we felt were important to talk about. There are many examples in the market that prove Agile as a software development methodology has worked really well. There's lots of research. Some of it is here on this slide. And the research has proven over and over again that the whole idea of introducing this thinking into your software engineering approach has had great value. The other thing is, though, we hear this phrase a lot, and maybe you do too. We hear the phrase, we've done Agile. And that needs a little defining and in context, because in almost every case when we hear that, it's really being referred to the use of Scrum in the organization. And Scrum is really one spoke on the wheel in general, and we'll discuss that a little later on. It's important to say that we support Scrum. It's been in use for well over a decade. Its principles and practices have proven effective. But there are many examples in the market where people want to do more and they realize the limitations of Scrum. And some of the Scrum rules are rigid and don't allow for easy scale in the enterprise. And so some of the barriers to entry or barriers to further adoption that are here on the right really speak to the idea that the traditional approach to Agile, if that's the right way to word it, has not proven as effective as many of us would have liked. Some of those barriers are really just calling out the fact that there isn't a standard in the market, and the lack of a standard in the market has been a barrier in many ways to itself. So when we say standard, we're talking about three things. We're talking about something that drives Agile innovation rather than limiting organizations to a single methodology. We're talking about how a standard helps people learn skills rather than just acquire knowledge. And we're also discussing how a standard shares good working practices and critical thinking. So when you take all of those things together, they make up a bigger story that's worth sharing. So clearly, one of the things that is going on in the market now for some time has been a massive talent shortage in the Agile community. And so if we look at the word Agile in the context of a role, and we're talking about people that fulfill roles such as Scrum Master, Product Owner, Coach, the idea of the community having access to a fair amount of very highly skilled practitioners has been a challenge. This slide actually represents some research that was conducted in the last year by Career Builder in Yo, who's a leading staffing agency. And it tells us what many of us have already figured out to be true, that the gap is quite wide, and it is actually increasing over time. As a global services company, we've experienced the same challenge. I think it's fair to say one of our challenges in the market for several years is finding people that actually can do this stuff really well. It was one of the reasons that led us to develop VFQ, which we'll be talking about more in a few moments. And unfortunately, it's trendy to put Agile on your resume or your CV. This has also contributed to a wide gap in experience and skills. We had one recruiting agency tell us that at a single point in time, they had over 40,000 CVs in their database, all with the word Agile on it. So that can give you a little idea of just how prevalent the term is being used in many ways today, but the correlating skill set isn't as big. And up to now, companies have had varied and often expensive experiments in trying to introduce and adopt Agile thinking and practice inside their companies. And the talent gap is really contributing on a big scale to that. So we wanted to talk about some of the things people are saying. In your organizations, you hear people make comments on a frequent basis. There are some comments you seem to remember more than others. We wanted to talk about some of the comments we're hearing in our community as well. So in addition to what you see here, we hear things like coaching isn't enough. There's definitely been many organizations, large enterprises specifically, that have discussed the idea that simply having the coaching role present isn't really driving adoption or transformation the way they would have hoped. We hear a lot about how the certified Scrum Master isn't a high enough quality standard, how the word certification is a difficult term to use in the context of training that you get over the course of 2 days, and how that learning doesn't stick. We've heard that Agile transformation is still largely a role and staffing-based approach. Again, looking at hiring roles into the organization rather than understanding the problem we're trying to solve. We've also heard that Agile training is really time-boxed learning today. If you look at the way Agile training has been conducted over the years, it's a time-boxed event. It really doesn't account for the personal learning journey that most of us have or need. And the other thing that we hear a lot is it's more expensive than what we expected, and the ROI hasn't always been easy to measure. So you might be able to insert your own sayings or comments into these bubbles, but there's a growing sense of confusion and questions about how do we really do this better now. It's almost as if we've come to a place where we've done well with what we've had, but there's a desire for more. So I want to pass it off to Phil so he can share a little bit about the context of what we're trying to put in this webinar. Phil?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everyone. So, as Alex mentioned right up front, we were going to talk and weave some of the experience of one of our clients through the rest of this slide deck. Maersk Line are a company who have been undergoing a transformation for many years, starting back in 2010. And they'd actually tried Scrum prior to that on one of their flagship projects. They'd hired in Scrum Masters and coaches and consultants to help implement the pretty simple framework of 4 ceremonies, 3 roles, and 3 artifacts into a complex change program. So they were looking to try and transform their whole customer experience and how they dealt with their clients. And that process didn't go particularly well for them. And they were very wary of this idea of a Scrum in a box solution. Now, in the Scrum handbook, the founders of Scrum actually make it very clear that Scrum is free. It's offered in a simple guide. It's got clear roles, clear artifacts, clear events, and the rules are immutable. And although implementing only parts of Scrum is possible, the result will not be Scrum. So Scrum only exists in its entirety and functions well as a container for other techniques, methodologies, and practices. So that's all well and good, but the reality is it changes the fundamental way that businesses make decisions. It changes the way that people authorize what work gets done, how we serve our clients, how we bring new products and services to market. And this is where some of the challenges start with the introduction of a new framework. So everyone starts with this notion that Scrum is very clear and simple. And then we start inviting coaches and Scrum Masters into an organization to help us adopt these approaches. But everyone's gone through this process who have worked in an agile environment to start changing what Scrum is on the very first day of walking into an environment. But the challenge is everybody's got their own view of what Scrum is and isn't and how it best adopts for that context. So over the last few years, we've seen a rise in many more frameworks, methodologies, principles, practices, all under the auspices of Agile. So very much seen a rise within things like Kanban, the Scaled Agile framework, which is a culmination of many practices that overlays onto a very traditional hierarchy. And there's lots of work in the product development space on how do we improve the flow of product and service development, how do we increase the quality. And so Scrum has become, because it's the best part of 15 years old, it's become a part of a much wider ecosystem of practices and principles that can be better applied to an enterprise. So the interesting thing about it is, and we've kind of gone through this process many times over the last 20 years, whereby a new framework comes out, a new methodology name hits the street, everyone thinks it's going to help us solve, some problem. DSDM went through this process in the late 90s. We've had the Prince 2, we've had ITIL. We've got Kanban, we've got Scrum, there's many methodology frameworks, RUP, Open Up. But the challenge is every project has a different budget, everyone has different scope, everyone has different benefits, and we're all affecting different systems. Every team has different capabilities, different people, different experiences, different skill sets. And every company has a different marketplace, different competitors, different customers, different suppliers, culture, economic and business models. And this framework that you see in front of us is one that helps us as we're going through our own processes with our clients, is to start trying to work out, what is the configuration of the specific organization we're working with or the project that we're working with, to see if we can get some patterns as to how a company is operating. So what their team size, where are the people located, what's the compliance and regulatory needs, how complex is the domain, how complex is the technology, what's the organizational distribution, complexity, discipline. And what we find is, as you'd expect, every organization looks vastly different. There are definitely commonalities. Many companies are now at this situation where they've got aging IT infrastructure, because 30 years ago the first IT systems were being deployed into many of our largest companies on earth. And they're now at that point where the business model has changed so much that we're having to look to do transformation of our underlying technology. The customer experiences are changing, and they're all driving a similar requirement. Now, if we look at it from a Maersk perspective for a second, what they found when they first started going through this, and they went through a discovery process, is from a technical perspective, they had a high level of dependency on legacy systems. So everything flowed through, a global customer services system. There are many organizations with similar mainframe technologies that sit right at the heart of the organization. The structural implications of the organizations: they had a significant offshore outsourced IT department, wasn't sat very closely to the business. The internal IT department couldn't guide their partner. The organizational, the budget and approvals processes could add months of time to any framework. So the yearly annual cycle of budgeting and planning, plus the authorization processes, and the cultural aspects of change, of taking people on a journey, trying to challenge the way that they're thinking and taking it forward, having already tried something like Scrum and it having not worked particularly well for them. They were still wanting this idea of agility, yet they were very much looking at the frameworks that existed out there and felt like it didn't solve their particular need. So when we looked at all of that, and then thinking about what we've done from other client rollouts, and this is what we hear from many companies that have been undergoing agile transformations for many years, is that they go through a similar pattern. And this is having a look at how effective the common approach to change and transformation is or is not working. So most companies will go through this idea of, we're going to go through an inception. We're going to come up with some form of coaching roadmap. We're going to come up with some form of transformation plan. We're going to bring in the coaches. And Agile coaching has become an industry within its own right over the last decade. And it's not always clear to a client what they're buying in terms of Agile coaching. So I have a disclaimer at this point, as I was actually a customer of Agile coaching once upon a time. And we were never really clear what we had bought in terms of, had we bought an Agile expert, or had we bought someone who was going to hold a set of values and principles to account of the team that they're working with. And what we decided when we were doing that was to look at it from we want the expertise to come in. So it wasn't so much about coaching, it was much more about doing the work and aiding the team. But we were also really clear that we wanted some lasting benefit to the employees that were working within that project. The challenge with a lot of the Agile transformations that we've seen over the years is that while the coaches are on the ground, they act as an energy source. They act as a change agent. They act as, a crux for the teams on the ground, and they provide lots of good learning, lots of good guidance, lots of good coaching. But the challenge is when they've gone away, what we've found is that the adoption rate kind of tails off and actually regresses towards the end of the time there. And the internal capability hasn't necessarily, benefited from the investment made by the client company. So the challenge there is that, it's introduced normally via a 2-day, 3-day training course. It's supplemented by some upfront coaching. There's teams that I know that spend 6 to 8 weeks with a coach upfront. That's given them enough of the capability just to run off on their own. And then the coach moves on to the next one, and the trainers move on to the next one. And it's a cycle of then health checks. How are we doing against some form of, maturity matrix? More health checks. Are we still doing the right things? And what we've never really found is that the teams and the individuals within their teams have really understood the reasons why. So they follow frameworks, and they get the ticks on the checklist of the Scrum checklist, or the Kanban principles, but they've never really developed the core understanding of why this was the right thing, and even challenged the overarching rules of the framework in order to make the right business decisions. So what we did with Maersk was actually we took it a slightly different way, and this is something that's been happening with other clients as well. But obviously the Maersk case study was something that we gave you when you registered for this, and there's more coming in terms of the story. But ultimately, instead of going down the framework route, we really spent a lot of time with the client to understand why. What was it about their context? Why did they need to address some of the underlying issues? And they came up with 8 key imperatives. So ultimately, they were looking at the end-to-end flow of value within the organization. And they realized that actually there were challenges within the whole end-to-end cycle, even though originally they were looking at it very much from an IT perspective. So this was how the business and IT, the supply chain, and everyone came together in dealing with customer requests. So they needed to get to the initial prioritization faster. They needed to improve that prioritization method using economics. So it gave some illumination on the challenges within the organizational context. That work was very much dynamic and prioritized often. They needed to reduce the size of the requirements so that they could see the work flow through the organization quicker. Get to the point of writing code quickly. So there was what they used to deem as the fuzzy front end of the requirements process was taking so long that the marketplace had moved on even before they got to the idea of actually proving something within code. They had this need to actively manage the work in progress. So when they did the initial analysis of their overall system, they actually realized that they were spending huge proportions of the workforce doing analysis and design up front. And then what they found was most of that analysis and design sat on a shelf and didn't really ever see the light of day. So even though that these were all great ideas, they weren't necessarily ever manifested themselves in value to the organization. So this active management of work in progress was really key to start smoothing out the sustainable flow of work. And then the final piece was to make sure that the faster feedback loops were in place. So even prior to Scrum, there was this whole extreme programming movement, which was very much about developers and software engineers coming up with feedback loops. And these things have grown over the years to incorporate concepts, the whole idea to market feedback loops and proof of concept feedback loops and coding feedback loops and continuous integration. So all of these ideas were sort of plugged into that final enable faster feedback cycles. So this was no solution delivery. You know, we helped them build, adopt, and adapt the tools that they needed for their context. One thing that we hear a lot from our clients and from organizations generally is that they want standardization. They want standard tools, standard methodologies, so that they can guarantee a clear framework of delivery. And what Maersk managed to do was to put enough consistency into the different projects and value streams that they had, but still allowed the teams to adopt and adapt the right techniques for the different technologies that they had. So what they did for their core system was slightly different to what they did for their CRM system. And underneath all of that was this idea and desire to help educate them so that they could basically self-sustain their own approach, so that they could run their own training courses and they could coach their own teams, and that they could develop their own solutions. So we helped them come up with the original 8 key imperatives, but the idea is that they should be able to do that, and this was the key thing for scaling within their own organization. As part of that whole process of the education, we introduced something called VFQ. So VFQ is a bit of an overloaded term for us. So value, flow, quality are the 3 outcomes that we believe clients are typically looking for. So how do we increase value, improve flow, and advance quality in all of our products and services and projects that we're delivering? Back in 2010, the Agile Alliance also made a key statement, which was, it is the position of the board that the employers should have confidence only in certifications that are skills-based and difficult to achieve. So this was actually a critique on the Agile certification marketplace, and this idea that employers had started looking for certified Scrum Masters without really knowing what level of benchmark that had provided. And there's many organizations who have gone and tried to develop more sophisticated certifications, and actually Scrum did themselves. They had the Scrum Professional and the Scrum Trainer, which were much more difficult, but there were only about 100 people in the world who had these things. So this idea of introducing something that was wider, overarching, methodology agnostic, skills-based, and helps people actually apply the principles within their own workplace is really what drove VFQ. And as Alex said right up front, even as a company ourselves, we also needed to hire and educate people who might have been very good in one methodology or framework discipline, but they weren't sensitive to the needs of an enterprise, needs of different market contexts, and could apply different and creative solutions to those different contexts. And that's where VFQ came from. So it's built on this idea of work-based learning, and this is really where we took the Maersk case study. So there's been a vogue in learning and development circles over the last few years around this idea of 70-20-10. So this is the idea that 70% of your learning happens in the workplace. 20% should happen through coaching, and that may be from peers or mentors within the organization, or superiors, or people who have more expertise in a specific field, or managers and leaders. And the final 10% really comes from the classroom training. And even that's starting to change with online learning and virtual training and e-learning that's cropping up now. So this is an interesting picture, because the Agile approach is really focused on the 10% of the training. So that is the predominant delivery method of most Agile courses today. And then The next 20% of the learning happens through coaching. And then what we have is we basically let people learn whatever they want to learn within the 70% of their time. And VFQ has started to plug that gap of that 70%. It builds on, allows people a set of resources that we'll go through in a moment to help them apply that learning within context, within the bounds of their own project or their own product, and get feedback on how things are working that can then be used within the coaching mechanisms and frameworks that are provided to people as well. So we believe that learning happens best when you're doing something and you get time to reflect on that. And people need the tools to make sure that they understand what activities they might be able to go through and what results they're particularly looking for. And then they can start synthesizing what they're learning within their own context and actually applying value directly to the organization through the work that they do.
Thanks, Bill. So just to tell you a little more about VFQ and some of the things that make up the actual product, to support learning in the workplace, we thought it was imperative to design VFQ as an education system, not just something that's a product, so to speak. And it needed to really underpin the efforts that organizations are currently taking in order to adopt agile thinking. So the whole idea was, how do you support what's already underway, and how do you actually make it more systemic in the way it's applied inside a company? There are a number of artifacts and resources that make up VFQ. I think it's important that we point out some of those things here, and again, we can provide some more information to you later. VFQ was developed over 2 years using a global research team. It hasn't been done in a small office. It's been done in a number of offices with people contributing globally to our research efforts as well. There's an extensive bibliography that has made up the product, and the research has supported that. It's a methodology agnostic learning and development program, and that's the way we typically describe it internally and to our clients as well. And the whole idea was, how do you make it outcome focused? Where so much of the industry is role based, we really wanted to look at the outcome oriented approach to making learning better. So some of the things on this slide talk about the components. There are session modules. These are thorough, concise explorations of key concepts and ideas that pertain to a particular topic, or as we said, an outcome. All the modules include case studies. There are activities for individuals and teams, and they've also been written to MBA level, to self-study levels as well. So the idea is, how do you create a high-quality learning product that can be picked up quickly by a person or a team? There are one-page summaries that support all the modules. We kind of call it a cheat sheet because they're good to pass around the organization, and they quickly summarize the specific topics. There's a technique library. So as Phil mentioned a few moments ago, people are looking for some standards. People are looking for a specific set of practices on how to go about doing this in their organization. So we often hear the term best practice, and it seems to be a taboo term to use in the context of Agile. But the reality is, companies want to know, how do we do some of this stuff? So we built a technique library that describes in detail a number of the core practices that are necessary to implement inside an organization. I like to refer to them as recipe cards because they really walk you through the ingredients necessary to successfully implement the technique, to see what it's supposed to look like when you're done implementing it. And we also add some reference information for additional learning in case you want to go off and do that. There are presentation slides. We supply each module with a supporting deck of high-quality slides that we find customers use internally to train their own teams. And there are assignments. The assignments are designed to guide learners through practical exercises so they can enhance their own projects and apply the concepts in practice. So to support that, one of the things we hear a lot is making learning stick. This is a phrase I'm sure you've heard as well. How do you make learning stick? Well, the only way you can really make it stick is it has to be about the people. And when it's about the people, it really has to focus on the items that you see here. It has to be a skills-based approach. The assignments, the exercises, the activities have to be practical. And the idea of doing them on the job, at your pace, on real projects, delivers immediate and lasting benefit. One of the terms that is often used in the same sentence with Agile is culture and mindset. And so in order to change people's views and challenge the traditional thinking that they have, it's important to give them that work-based approach. So it's not just done in a time-boxed event, but they're in it each day, going through a series of activities to help that learning stick. And lastly, as you can see here, the whole idea around the stickiness is really attitude. And so VFQ has become more of a system in learning and development because the learning is there, but then the ongoing development that's so key is also prevalent. So a few moments ago, Phil shared a slide with you on some of the challenges with adoption and some of the reasons why it's more role-based and how that learning doesn't stick, in fact. In this slide, we wanted to show a journey example of a number of clients who have applied work-based learning and how dramatic the difference is. So you can see that people still go through this inception period, and they still bring in that subject matter expertise and the coaching that's needed to begin the journey. But the immediate view here is that the investment in the coaching element actually decreases over time because the increasing of the client teams on the ground grows so dramatically. That adoption rate hits a curve that traditionally you wouldn't be able to get to with just the standard approach to how companies do this. So we like to call this education-led transformation. The whole idea is getting people to learn and to do this as quickly as possible so they're self-sustained and they're able to get very used to applying the practices in their context. The idea here is that there is still a need for external expertise, but when it's coupled with a work-based learning approach, the total investment looks very different, and I would say it's arguably compelling for many companies, not only from a cost saving, but more importantly from a learning rate of their own people on the ground. Phil, can you share a little more on the certification part?
Yeah, so I hope you can hear me okay. Someone had asked a question for me to speak up a little. So the BCS, I'm sure many in the UK will know about the British Computer Society, Chartered Institute for IT. VFQ has become the bedrock for the Agile Practitioner certification, and is something that's also we're exploring building the expert certification for them as well. So this is quite different to most of the other certifications and qualifications in the marketplace. We've actually built it to postgraduate standards, and VFQ is in use within universities as well for postgraduate degrees. And effectively, the statement that was made by the Agile Alliance back in 2010 was about creating a certification that employers and employees could ensure a standard. It was difficult to achieve, and it was skills-based. And the thing that we've been looking at in terms of skills-based is actually slightly differently to most of the other frameworks and methodologies out there, because what they test for is the application of that framework, and knowing how the process operates and knowing what steps come when and how to deliver certain artifacts. But what sets this certification apart is actually what we've been looking to test for and examine for is creative and solutioneering for a specific problem space. So this should be enabling critical thinking to examine your own end-to-end value stream, your own processes, and deploy the right solution that makes the most value flow and quality sense within your context, within the products and services that your company builds. So this means that rather than you deploy a specific framework, even though that may be the right answer under some contexts. It allows people to explore that context and deploy the right answer that makes sense for that project. We have been running the exams over the summer. We've had about 70, 80 people go through the initial pilot groups. The feedback has been very good. And it really sets a different approach to the certification in the marketplace, because it has been very tough to achieve. And you'll see here that Charles Agnew, who's the CIO for the Department for International Development, has very much endorsed the certification process, because it's helped him create a shift in the application of these thinking tools and their own development processes within the organization. So the other organization that helped us develop this, and now this has become much more global. We have people in different continents having taken the exam and given the feedback and actually demonstrated the value. So Maersk also undertook this through the summer, and this was the culmination of their in-work learning program, in trying to get their 50 people, 50 internal champions up to the level and standard to continue the rollout. And they've got a pretty good success rate through the program. They've actually built a whole internal expertise program underneath Uslam, who is quoted previously in the deck, and they actually have no requirement for external support anymore, and they continue the rollout on their own, and they have their own people challenge their own leadership in order to make sure that their software and product development processes are working in a way that makes sense for their economic climate. So, people walk around and they're all talking about how they can break down their ideas, how they can deliver value early and often, how they can optimize the end-to-end flow of value to their customers, how their value streams sort of operate. And so that learning has really stuck, and the certification program has helped encourage more and more people get on board. So the work-based learning process and that has developed an internal capability that I would argue many organizations would be striving for themselves. So the final part of the case study that you guys would have downloaded is really the results. So this is after a 3-year transformation program where they've been rolling it out across large, complex legacy systems, major programs of, enterprise architecture, SOA architectures, CRM system, off-the-shelf, outsourced IT, and their increased ROI. Most organizations I've come across don't necessarily really understand the value that's delivered by IT in any empirical way, but Maersk were actually pretty good at managing these sorts of numbers, and they had statistics for everything, so they could demonstrate that they delivered a 5 to 10 times increase in the ROI. Their time to market on average for requirements actually reduced by 50%. So they were taking over a year to deliver some requirements. So if you had an idea, it would take at least 365 days to work through the system. They shaved a huge amount of time off that on average. Their throughput increased, even though this wasn't something that they were necessarily looking for at the time. And the quality that was produced was also pretty huge as well. So the goal for most of them, most of the systems within Maersk, was to be able to deliver something from idea to the marketplace within 90 days, regardless of what it was. And across the estate of 400 internal employees plus suppliers, they managed to deliver that, and they continue to improve upon that journey today.
Thanks, Phil. So to wrap it up, everyone, a couple of questions that we often get asked. How does an organization get going or learn more? we'd be happy to share more with you about how it's being used. We'd also be happy to even share some of the material. You can contact us in a number of ways, so feel free to do that. We also get asked a lot how organizations leverage their current investment and any training they've done to date. We can definitely give you some of that context as well and tell you how organizations are introducing VFQ alongside what they may have already spent to date and how that's making sense for them. So we're available to do that. So just want to thank you for taking the time. We're definitely at a few minutes over. We're happy to answer any questions. We can stay on for a few more moments, or you can contact us directly if you have anything you'd like to ask, and we'll get back to you. So thank you for making the time today. We know people are very busy, and we appreciate you coming out.